guys, welcome back to a new episode of my do's and don'ts series, and in this one we're going to be doing a different medium. I'm going to be doing a do's and don'ts for watercolour. So I'm going to be going through like the general sort of things you should avoid doing when using watercolours, and also some sort of tips on things you could try doing to make your watercolour work look even better. So anyway guys, let's get straight into it. The first three don'ts are things that you should avoid doing before you even start painting. And that is, first, try to avoid using cheap paper that's not designed for watercolours. Also, don't have your sketch too dark, otherwise it will show through your painting. And don't paint on loose paper. Instead, what you want to do is use watercolour paper, something that's designed to take wet medium, and also keep your sketch as light as possible and tape down the paper or stretch it so it avoids warping. The next don't is not to add water absolutely everywhere, and don't add tons of water. What I would recommend instead is just to apply the water where you actually want to do your painting. So for example, I'll be working on the skin first, so I just add water to that area, not to the actual iris or the white of the eye, just to the part you're working on, and don't add tons of it. You don't want pools of water. Just dampen the paper, because the more water you add, the harder it is to actually control where the watercolours goes, and they will actually bleed into each other a lot more. So the next thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to apply your colours straight to your painting, because it's really hard to reverse the process if you figure out that the colour's not quite right. So what I'd recommend doing instead is to just test your colours first on a test bit of paper, a scrap bit of paper, and then once you're happy with them, then apply them to your painting. When you're adding your first wash of colour, what you want to avoid doing is add paint absolutely everywhere. So just cover the whole area in paint. That's something that you want to avoid doing unless you really do need to add the wash everywhere. What I would recommend doing instead is start with a light wash. Just start very, very lightly, hardly any pigment on your brush, mainly water, and just start with a very light wash. And again, you don't need to add this everywhere, because with watercolour, it's hard to get that white paper back. So you really need to try and preserve the highlighted areas. And this means that you need to have a lot of patience in order to build up these layers. But it is important to try and preserve the highlights, because it's hard to get them back, and you do want to have contrast in your watercolor piece, so you do need to preserve those highlights, because normally the white like watercolor paint isn't that great. Here you can see that I'm adding the layers. It does take quite a long time. This part of the actual eye, the skin, was one of the most time consuming processes, but it's really worth it to really focus and just build up those layers. And as you can see on the right hand side of the painting, I've kept that very light because the right hand side was more highlighted. The next don't is a really important one, and that is to not just keep adding lots and lots of layers without letting the previous layers dry, because what this will mean is that you're going to have a lot of colours bleeding into each other if all of the areas are still wet. So as you can see, when I added the eyelashes or these little individual eyebrow hairs, they all just blur out into the areas nearby, into the skin, because the layers underneath, the skin layers, weren't dry. So this can be a common thing that beginners do because they're impatient and they just want to get onto the next layer. But it is so important that you actually go in and wait for the previous layers to dry. So you need to work in layers, as you can see with the white of the eye here. I added some grey tones, then I go over with the flesh colours, and I do let those layers dry before I add new ones. So for example, when I'm working on this iris, I let the white of the eye dry and all of the surrounding areas, so that you don't actually get bleeding between the areas. You don't get the black from the iris bleeding into the white of the eye. You can use a hairdryer if you want to actually dry the layers. It quickens it up if you are a bit impatient. I like to do that. And another tip for you guys is, if you want to add highlights and the paint is still wet, then go in with a clean damp brush and you can use that to pull and lift some of the colours up. And you can see that because I let the layers of skin dry, when I add the eyelashes, it's really crisp, really clean, nothing bleeds into each other, and you get a much more polished look. So it's really nice to use the wet and wet method to get smooth looks and no like harsh edges. But when you need to go and add detail, that's when it's important to make sure that you let all of the areas dry so that you can go in and add the crisp details. Another don't that you really want to avoid doing is using lots of water to actually blend your dark sort of watercolour areas. And you don't want to scrub with the paintbrush either, otherwise it will create like bits of paper and tear the paper. And another thing that I would say is try not to stick to the exact same techniques. Instead, like I said, instead of using the scrubbing motion with your paintbrush, work really, really gently. As you can see with the paintbrush here, I'm very softly feathering in those eyebrow hairs. I'm not scrubbing, not going back and forth with the paintbrush. Also, try different techniques and mediums. It really helps take your painting to that next level if you use some other mediums to help make it better. So for example, I love to use gouache to add the highlights at the end. As you can see here, it just really adds to that contrast and gives the eye a really shiny, wet look to it. You don't have to just use the white gouache for like the really bright highlights. You can also use it for more subtle highlights, whether you just want to lighten up an area. And so the more water you add to the gouache, the more translucent it's going to be. And the thicker it is, the less water you add, the more concentrated and opaque it will be. But either way, it's great to lighten up areas of the skin like I'm doing now, just to boost it a bit and give it a bit more brightness, or even just to add those really, really bright highlights in the iris, in the tear duct, and also on the waterline as well. They are great for that, and I definitely love to use gouache in all of my paintings. I can't live without this. I use the Winsor & Newton gouache, and all of the products that I do use are listed in the description below if you want to check them out. Another medium that I absolutely love to use with watercolours is coloured pencil. I think that coloured pencil is great for the details. So if you want to crispen up a few edges, or shade in a bit of highlight, or add some more shadow to the skin like I'll do in a minute, you can see that it really just helps crispen and render everything a little bit better. And it's great if you just want to add some details. So there's no reason why you can't mix together different techniques like the wet and wet method, and then wait for that to dry and add more detailed work, add white gouache for the highlights, and add colour pencil for the details. As you can see, the cheap paper really did make the paper warp a bit. You can see it's so wavy, and here is a comparison between the don't eye and the finished do eye. But I really hope you guys enjoyed that video tutorial thing. If you want to see the full real-time version of this painting, then it is available on Patreon for you guys, as well as loads of other real-time tutorials, whether that's colour pencil, graphite, watercolour, markers, whether that's portrait, animals. There's over 100 tutorials already on there right now for you guys, and just for a small amount per month. Anyway guys, that is it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see even more do's and don'ts videos, make sure to hit that subscribe button. But that is it for today's video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye everybody!